Hi, everybody. Welcome to Rice Talks Racial Justice, hosted by the Association of Rice Alumni. A few housekeeping items before we get started. After Drs. Bratter and Pinn finish their conversation, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So throughout this whole presentation, and even during the Q&A portion, feel free to add your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So with the public murder of George Floyd this summer and William Marsh Rice's history of owning slaves, many of us in the Rice community are prioritizing learning about the racial injustice that has permeated American history. And today we're so lucky to be joined by two amazing Rice professors that are going to have a conversation about some questions that they've been struggling with. Anthony Pinn, the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Religious Studies Professor here at Rice. He's also the founding director of Rice University's Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning and the inaugural director of Rice's Center for African and African American Studies. Quite a mouthful, Dr. Pinn. We're also joined by Jennifer Bratter, a professor of sociology here at Rice and the inaugural director of BRIDGE, which stands for Building Research on Inequality and Diversity to Grow Equity that Fosters Scholarship on Inequality within Diverse Settings. Also quite a mouthful. I'm so excited y'all are both here. So welcome, Dr. Pinn and Dr. Bratter.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone who's joining us this afternoon. We're very, very excited that you could be here today to have this important and critical conversation. So where we wanted to start today is with a core question that drives anyone who thinks about race, particularly the experiences of Black Americans. This question was posed by W.E.B. DuBoise, sociologist, Black American sociologist in the early 1900s, where he asked, how does it feel to be a problem? And so I'm going to pose this question for my esteemed colleague to begin pondering. How does it feel to be a problem today?
Well, first, let me say it's always great to chat with you. We don't have opportunity to do that enough. We share DuBoise. He has had significance for both of our fields of study, and in particular, The Souls of Black Folk is a tremendous text. It's hauntingly relevant in 2020. He's addressing the aftermath of Reconstruction, the failure of Reconstruction, but it's still so very applicable. We tend to wrestle with that text in terms of one of the two central questions. That question is, what is to be done with the Negro? Right? After the failure of Reconstruction on the level of economics, politics, culture, what is to be done with this group? And we spend a lot of time on that question, but he begins with another question that receives less attention. How does it feel to be a problem? And he argues that it's the question that particularly whites are reluctant to ask him. And it's a question for which he doesn't have a very good answer. I find it particularly compelling because it is concerned with the material nature of life, but it's also concerned with the psychological, the affective dimensions of disregard within the context of the United States. So I find it particularly compelling for that reason.
Well, I also think it's compelling because of its many answers. So if we think about what that question brings up in that time, we also have the responses of people like Booker T. Washington, who are thinking through this question in terms of the Negro problem as being resolved by, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And I think that there's this clear tension between, W.B. Du Bois, who is writing not only, as a scholar, but as also a sociologist who's saying, like, let's think about our structural conditions and the role that they play in the conditions of the Negro, versus the tension, versus the sort of other perspective, which is that this problem is the Negro problem, and then the Negro can solve it without any attention to kind of the conditions that created that. And I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear your perspective, since we have this opportunity to talk that we don't really get, to what degree is that duality still present? Like when we're thinking about the problem as it is scoped out today, do we still have this tension between personal responsibility and that the Negro is responsible for the Negro problem versus outlining the sort of structural nature of what it means to be Black in America?
I mean, that's a good point. I would argue that what Booker T. Washington is getting at is the what should be done with the Negro question, right? So if you think in terms of 1895 and the speech he gives in Atlanta, right? The speech in which he says, basically, when it comes to the economic well-being of the nation, we function as a hand. But when it comes to social issues, Blacks and white are as separate as the fingers, right? So it seems to me he's not wrestling with that first question. He, like most, are wrestling with that second question. The first question for me kind of revolves around Du Bois's effort to get at how Black people are thought, right? What are the patterns of thought that shape perception with respect to Black people, and as a consequence, determine how we are treated? I see no reason to think that those patterns of thought have gone away. We've come up with new ways in this country of exercising those patterns, new ways to demonstrate disregard. But from the very beginning to 2020, the United States is premised upon a deep disregard for, a deep suspicion towards people of African descent. That pattern of thinking then influences and informs behavior.
Yeah, I mean, but I think and I mean, this is probably just, well, I think if its manifestation in the current moment is hard to wrap our heads around, because part of what's driving this moment of social justice is this, at least, understanding that we are now finally getting it, like getting the contours of the problem in a new way, that's why there's unrest and protest, and we're having this conversation in the midst of an alumni weekend and a discussion, because we all have an understanding that this is different than before, where these problems and that way of thinking was still present, but we still had a way of existing despite the fact that that way of thinking was still there. But I guess I wonder, again, if it is or isn't it different, like how do we gauge and capture that? I mean, what comes to my mind is the fact that when we think about framing Blackness as a problem, we have now a language to talk about racial inequality where, we're thinking about the value of life in terms of, well, there's life expectancies that are shorter, there's poverty, there's disadvantage, there are all these individuals who are sort of symbols of all of the sort of racism and inequality, and that becomes the majority of where Black people are inserted in the conversation. And so in my mind, I feel like our ways of crafting that problem and thinking in terms of that problem have become maybe more complex, but I would agree that it hasn't changed. But I'm wondering if we sort of believe like, okay, now we get it. Now we understand the nature of this problem. We're still wrestling with it. But my attention is that I feel like we're still hemmed in and thinking about Black people as primarily a problem, even if the problem has shifted or is rearticulated.
I would agree with you in terms of rearticulated,
Okay.
but I don't think that the way in which this country thinks Blackness has altered. I don't see a functional difference, right? A difference of perception between the killing of Breonna Taylor or George Floyd and earlier 20th century lynchings, right? That the way in which Blacks are still depicted as a threat remains consistent. I think we convinced ourselves that things were different, right? And we don't have to go any further back than the civil rights movement. Moving forward, we assumed that we had a handle on this problem, not simply in terms of material conditions, but on the level of morality, that we had a way of thinking about this that had advanced. But I just don't see, I don't see the evidence to support that. I think Cornel West is correct. In the 80s, he argued that the idea that Black people are human is a fairly new idea in the modern West.
Mm. So you don't think that conversation has advanced much since the days of lynching?
I don't see how if we think about that conversation in terms of how people of African descent, by and large, are understood within the context of this country, how they are handled within the context of this country, I don't see a noteworthy shift, right? I don't see anything that really suggests advancement beyond the old paradigms of racialization.
Mm. So I'm going to push you on that just because we've got the opportunity. Because usually, I mean, I think that's an argument that is made, and yet the common pushbacks are, but we've had the Civil Rights Act and all of the acts, you know, and we've had decades since, and progress marked in the growth of the Black middle class, and progress marked in the entree of people of color taking political positions, and that's supposed to, again, usher in at least the potential for more equity. We have various other means to say that this moment is different because after the George Floyd killing, the unrest that occurred suggests that it is viewed as a collective problem enough for people to take to the streets. So I would love to hear your reaction to that, because I do understand the, like, you know, are we still in a different place because we think we are? But how would you respond to someone who said that, wait, what about all of these indicators of progress?
Well, it seems to me, if civil rights moving forward, there's a book that was published in the 1980s that I think is still relevant, The Myth of Black Progress. Mm-hmm. Right, and so, yes, there is a Black middle class, but it seems to me if you look at the predicament of the vast majority of African Americans, we're not talking about a tremendous step forward. I'd also argue that the genius of anti-Black racism is its ability to maneuver, to maintain itself in the face of exceptions. Right? So you can think, for example, of President Obama as being an exception. This did not break the system. The system was easily able to incorporate this, in part through the perception of exception. Well, he's not like the others. Right? That I don't see that breaks the stereotype. So again, it seems to me within the context of this system, you can have some African Americans doing really well, like us. But that is meant to reinforce the logic of the system. But the vast majority of African Americans, what kind of progress has been made for the vast majority of African Americans since the Civil Rights Movement? So you have the thinking of a Martin Luther King Jr., but you also have the thinking of a Derek Bell, right? The law professor at Harvard Law School, who thought that you can't really legislate preference, right? That the Civil Rights Movement is not going to legislate preference. It is not going to make people like each other. And so what you have to put in place are regulation structures that limit the impact of that dislike. It seems to me that thinking is much more in line with what is actually taking place. Now, I don't know how folks with us have voted, and for me, it's somewhat irrelevant. But I would argue that on some level, the shift from Obama to Donald Trump, if you read him through quotes, reinforces white supremacy and white privilege. That what you get from my vantage point with a Donald Trump is an unspoken argument that it's not education, it's not experience. At the end of the day, what qualifies as whiteness? And his appeal to so many wasn't an economic or political appeal. It was a social appeal that goes back centuries. You may not be rich, you may not be well placed, but at least you're not Black.
Right. Right.
So I don't see the advancement, but let's switch this a bit. From your vantage point as a sociologist, where are we?
Ah, it's not great. Where are we? I mean, it's where we are is in the midst of persisting inequalities on about every single dimension. And so I actually did offer that as kind of a straw man argument, because most of the metrics that tell us about where we are in terms of issues of racial justice and the promise of full participation across racial groups, and that also means across class groups, shows that inequality is sustained and worsening. It's worsening in terms of, as I was saying, like life expectancy. Yes, people are sort of living longer, but the gaps are still there. Maternal mortality, the racial gaps are there and widening. Infant mortality, the gaps are there, and Black infants are far more likely to die than white infants, and that's just the health realm. If we're looking at where people live and where people go to school, we have persisting segregation in neighborhoods, and we're in an era of resegregating in terms of our education system. And I think those are also indicators that lab on to what you're referring to earlier about you can't legislate preference. Those are spheres where preference absolutely matters. There's a lot of thinking about how that preference gets structured. Is it really racism or is it really something else? But what it really boils down to is an avoidance or an overarching preference away from Black spaces, which translates into a disinvestment in Black spaces, which means that if you happen to live in Black spaces, you are always living with less. And then again, there are always exceptions, but what we also see is that even in those exceptions, there's tremendous fragility. There's fragility in the Black middle class that doesn't exist in the white middle class. When economic booms happen and you have this powerful Black middle class, things are fine. But then when the recession hits and people are losing their homes, Black middle class are the ones who feel it in a way that their white peers don't. And wealth gaps tell us the same thing, that we have tremendous amounts of wealth divides between Blacks and whites and between Latinos and whites. So we have all of that, and then of course there's mass incarceration and, various other metrics in the middle of a sort of moment where culturally we like to tell ourselves that things are okay. We have exceptions and we have many visible examples of participation in spaces where both races are present and things seem to go well, or an outpouring of concern and even activism on behalf of slain Black people. But when we think about the day-to-day and we think about the distribution of political, cultural, and social resources, we still continue to see disinvestment. If we didn't, then we wouldn't have, again, school segregation to me is one of the most hardened indicators, because this is where people are voting preferences towards their most cherished resource, their children. And how we organize that, or how we organize where we're going to live, or how we organize who we're going to vote for, or anything, all of it sort of points to the same direction. And so I think our question as folks who live in this world and want to know how we can improve is, I think what we haven't wrestled with is what keeps that in place. Mm-hmm. It obviously doesn't take much because it's so persisting. It actually does take a lot of work to hold a system that's racially segregated in place for as long as we have. But what we don't really know is what are the foundations that keep it in place? Why does it seem so hard to dismantle? Every effort to dismantle gets undercut, so Voting Rights Act, wonderful achievement, was gutted years back in terms of many of the prescriptions that held certain states accountable for how they may be disenfranchising their minority voters. Other types of legislation that, again, were about widening or lessening inequality, again, it's difficult to enforce. And then here we are. So, I mean, as a sociologist, I think, the question is not really are we unequal? We're like, yeah, yes, there's massive inequalities. What are the consequences of those? We're wrestling with those, but what keeps it in place is, I think, the big question.
And so what do we do?
I don't know. I think voting is really important. I think we really need to vote, and we need to take the process seriously. I think we have more energy around understanding the process today than we ever have in any of the voting cycles I can recall, which is a start, because then we're making our system accountable, and we're not taking for granted that it works. But I do think that what do we do? I think we have to step back and think about all the ways in which privilege operates in ways that are beyond not just preference, but, you know, like we need to sort of disassociate the, like, this is about active bias. We know it's not about active bias. This is not just about a collection of mean people who set up bad things. This is about how we agree on a day-to-day basis to keep these systems in place. Actually, I think we have a question, Tony, if we want to engage it.
Sure.
See, we are on the cusp of a national election. If a more progressive Congress and president should win, what policy changes by government could support a move towards greater equity and opportunity for African Americans? Thank you, Greg Marshall. Tony, why don't you take that one?
Again, I go back to mindset, right? So I want to bracket policy for a moment and think in terms of posture. That one of the benefits of the civil rights movement moving forward, include Black Lives Matter, is the way in which it made visible white privilege and white supremacy. Mm-hmm. Right? One of the advantages of white supremacy is the ability to utilize invisibility when it's beneficial. That we have stuff because we're better.
Right, right.
We are better represented in these schools because we're better. Mm-hmm. Right? And it exposes that. I don't know that policy, while important, exposes that. I think one of the things that has to happen is a change in orientation, ongoing protest that disrupts, but a change in orientation. That one of the things that history teaches us is we find ways to do harm. That difference is a problem to solve from our perspective. And that what we have to move towards, it seems to me, is not outcome-driven strategies. Those have not worked, but a recognition of our effort as process. We can't determine the outcomes, right? We've seen too many steps backwards, but it's a matter of process, that there is something freeing in our rendering of white supremacy visible. There is something freeing in our struggle against, right? That this graphic and loud no to injustice has significance. And that it seems to me we have to become comfortable wrestling within a context in which change is unlikely. And so I don't know, in terms of policy, I don't know that changing the players changes the system. I don't have much reason to believe that is the case. So changes in policy will be wonderful, but within the context of a US that is structured as it's currently structured, change in policy doesn't go deep enough. There are underlying systemic issues that have to be addressed.
Yeah. I think that's what I found most exciting about, you know, the defund the police calls, because it really allowed us to wrestle with, well, why? Well, what is it about policing that could be deemed as a problem? And so when, you know, during our sort of reckoning with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all the other names that we could list, the calls for, again, defund the police or even reallocate funding from policing to other spots, I think allowed a sort of honest window into that sort of reorientation of systems. And I bring that up because I think the question about systems or wrestling with systemic inequalities is an important one, but it's so abstract. Like, it's very hard for, you know, particularly if you're not constantly reading about these issues, to sort of envision, like, what do you mean systems?
Mhm.
how am I supposed to reorient a system? And I think what you do is you unsettle the assumptions about that system and think about, well, what are the goals of this particular institution? If it's higher education, then you're supposed to be educating people. If it's policing, then you're supposed to be providing justice, and then asking hard questions about whether or not those goals are met, but also asking hard questions about, are there other ways to meet those goals? And I think that is deeper than policy, because policies are built on supporting the current system and the current institution. It's like, okay, we know how this works, and we're going to put in place some things that are going to make it work better.
Yeah.
What you have to do is sort of question whether or not things are working at all.
And what is the system designed to do?
Right. Right.
Right. U.S. government is designed to do what? Right. So I think you're right that one of the fundamental things that needs to happen is the asking of better questions.
Yes.
Right. And it seems to me that kind of disruption is vital. And so the defund the police becomes an important conversation because it raises questions concerning what law and order is actually about. What is the perception of Black bodies in time and space that made that approach useful?
That's right. And also, what does it mean when it fails? Because I think it was so critical to see the killings of Floyd and Arbery and Taylor and everyone as a failure of systems, and a failure, not a failure of individual policing, but a failure of the way police work is being done. Like, this is not good. Like this, if you're a taxpayer, you should be incensed that your dollars are going to a system that produces this type of outcome. So I think on one hand, we can ask ourselves whether these systems are working the way they're supposed to, but also see these as consequences of when systems don't work, and it harms everyone. I think what was just so overwhelming is that this is what we see as police work, and is that okay? Like, that's not the way it's supposed to work for anyone anywhere. But it means that there's something about the way police work, or police policy, or criminal justice policy is constructed where this is even possible. And I also think it calls to mind the way in which we hold each other or hold our systems accountable for failure. Because if you're not meeting these standards, then you should absolutely not have the benefit of resources. And I think part of where the conversation over the summer was sort of going in a direction that seemed different than previous conversations was, hey, there's something broken here in this system, as opposed to, well, we're just going to punish these individuals and hope that that's sufficient.
Yeah, I think that question still has to be wrestled with. Is the system broken, or did it work the way it was intended to work? Did it safeguard the privileged population?
That's a good point.
Right, so it seems to me the difference between George Floyd and all of the nameless folks who have been brutalized is the way in which we saw this in real time, right? The graphic nature of this system in real time. It seems to me that is the difference. But again, I would argue it's a question we have to wrestle with. Is the system working? And I think you can make a reasonable argument that as it was intended to work, it works. Right? If you can think about historically a Black population as suspect, needing to be conditioned and bound, right? That super surveillance on how this population moves through time and space is essential to the maintenance of society. Well, then it functioned. Right, so again, my argument would be that rethinking how we maintain well-being, right? How we safeguard well-being, rather than policing or law and order. How how do we nurture and maintain well-being requires an underlying question. How do we understand Black people? How do we understand brown people? How do we think Black and brown people? Because if we think them as a problem, the system works.
Right. And also, how do we maintain that type of thinking? Because I think what is overwhelming to me is the reproduction of that thought, that you can draw a line from Emmett Till to Floyd, or from lynching in the 1920s to today. I think a part of that reckoning is about understanding what do we do, generationally speaking, to keep that in place. Because even though the systems, I mean, just following your argument, the systems are perhaps working the way they were intended to work, they still change. I mean, like the notion of mass incarceration, is not centuries old. I mean, yes, we've been policing Black folk forever, but that was a unique explosion that happened starting, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s with the sort of drug war. And that says that these systems are adaptable to new conditions, to again, change, but to accommodate that vision. I think one of the things and I think this does come back to policy, that we don't really have a good handle on, is how do we reproduce this through policy? When we think we're making strides, are we actually just continuing on this certain patterns that will, again, provide a continuation of that vision of Blackness as a body of people who need policing or whose opportunities are less valuable. I think it's harder for people to sort of wrestle with that as a sort of active policy goal, because we don't have any race policies that say, okay, this policy is to designate this group as less valuable. It just happens. It just happens that way. And so I think the way in which we reproduce it also becomes harder to reckon with. But it's there. I mean, it's absolutely there.
And that's where asking good questions becomes extremely important, right? That we go through this process, raising the question, why do we make this assumption, right? Why this stereotype? Why this thinking, right? Why this process? So that becomes a rather powerful question. But I would argue that, yeah, in 80s, 90s, you get a certain perception of threat, right? Super predators will become the language. But it seems to me, even prior to that, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, you have a rethinking of how to capture and utilize Black labor.
Right.
It takes a certain look in the late 20th century, but it seems to me it's an older process of thought. How do we capture and utilize Black labor post-slavery? But again, I think we're agreeing here that that it requires some attention to the underlying impulse, the underlying rationale, right? Why do we think populations the way we think them? And it seems to me a useful exercise along these lines is to have public conversation concerning reparations and see what that surface is concerning our assumptions with respect to Black life and Black well-being.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to ask a different kind of question. So the second question that we were going to pose today was, what does it mean to live without hope? Which was adapted from Albert Camus. So I would love for you to wrestle with that, and then we'll see what we have in the chat.
I think about that in terms of, and he's one of my favorite thinkers. I mean, he has shaped my thought for a while now. And I typically go back to this short essay in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays. And it's the essay on Sisyphus. right? And Sisyphus is the one who is being punished by the Greek gods, and this punishment involves having to roll this rock up a hill only to have it come back down, and then he rolls it back up again, and this is forever. And the idea behind this punishment is it will break him. And Camus argues it doesn't. He reaches a point of awareness, of lucidity. He's deeply aware of his circumstances and not conquered by them. He continues to push. And so from that, I think we learn a valuable lesson, and that lesson is perpetual rebellion. The need to continuously struggle, recognizing that systems improve themselves. Right? That this injustice is web-like in nature, right? It advances. This is its genius, its ability to protect itself. And so we follow the lead of Sisyphus and exercise perpetual rebellion. It's not outcome-driven. It recognizes that if we talk about transformation or talk about liberation, it may only be found in our ability to say no to injustice with increased volume and persistence. But we'll fix one element of this system, maybe, and find out other ways in which we've done injustice. So I would argue that some of this involves, there's a question concerning the way in which social media kind of highlighted this issue on a global level and has produced a tremendous amount of pushback, and will that cause changes in policy? It may, but I'm not quite convinced that changes in policy is the same as a system transformed, right? I don't know that undercuts the underlying issue, the underlying nature of disregard. It's a manifestation of that disregard. But there's something underlying it.
I think there is something underlying, and I'm still visioning the rock and it's rolling down, and it's a powerful image, because I think in terms of the way social media can unravel this, then that suggests that it was really just about communication and providing more people the opportunity to participate. But I think what we forget is that we still maintain the silos and the sort of social separation that underlied that perception in the first place. And also, you know, social media as a venue is still a system in and of itself. You know, it's not necessarily, I mean, there's always this conversation about whether or not it can be democratized, but I do think that it reinforces a lot of the bubbles that we had found ourselves in, and that can become a way in which those systems can persist.
We have a lot of questions. Here's one.
Okay.
What are your ideas on specific areas of inequality that should be addressed now? Action that can leverage the massive national attention that is being placed on racial disparities this election year. Perhaps your idea of a top 3 list in order.
That's tough.
At the top of the list, I would put a national conversation concerning reparations.
I think my hit list would start with a national conversation on racial integration. Oh, no, actually, no, I'm sorry. I love integrate, that's great. But I think a national conversation about neighborhood organization, neighborhood investment. I just, where people live, I need communities to be supported. I mean, I think it's tied to reparations, but the pattern of neighborhood investment and how we can allow some neighborhoods to go and communities to go into decay and others not. I feel like what the pandemic has exposed is how incredibly critical and incredibly tied all of that is to just well-being in the most core place. That inequality weaponized this pandemic. And so for me, I mean, I think my mind goes immediately to reparations as a way to remedy the unbalanced investment across places where people live. and then lots of other things.
Yeah. But I would highlight reparations because it not only gets at the material nature of life, but it also forces us to wrestle again with how we think about people, how we think Blackness.
Yeah. Yes. No, that is very true. Yeah. I'm still pondering.
And so, you know, there are lots of questions concerning what things we ought to be wrestling with, whether it's voter suppression. It seems to me, yes, right, that we ought to wrestle with all of these, that there ought to be effort, there ought to be protest along those lines. I'm simply saying that undergirding that has to be attention to the underlying perception of Blackness, the underlying thinking on Blackness.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be helpful in that conversation to also reckon with what the current thinking on, like what have been we're clear on the consequences of a certain kind of thinking on Blackness, but I think we also need to wrestle with the benefits, like who benefits from a certain thinking on Blackness. Because I think a part of where we go wrong with policies and why we have to ask better questions is we understand that, okay, if we just fix the policies, then these very sort of separate and segregated groups will get more, but the rest of us are okay. And it's like, no, like if we really rethink Blackness, we have to also reckon with the fact that some people have benefited from a very specific kind of way to think about groups, think about Black people, brown people. And that means that's why it has to be a sort of systemic conversation. So if it's voter suppression, like everybody loses when votes are suppressed. We can't just think about it as like, well, we have to do this for this group. Like this group is you. Mm-hmm. This group can be you. This group is you. If you don't think it's you, it's you. And I think part of where we go wrong is we are thinking about Blackness as not just about constructing an other and other that needs policing or whatever, but it's also about constructing anyone who's non-Black as totally free of that. And I think what we need to reckon with is how that construction has been just universally harmful, as a country.
Here's a question for you. What do you make of all the anti-racist reading lists and virtue signaling from companies? Is this a performance, or do you think it's genuine on the way to transformation?
That's a wonderful question. I actually listened to a podcast during the summer. I wish I could remember the name of the author who was talking. She authored a book called White Negroes. So I'll promote her book if you want to look it up on Amazon, but it was a wonderful discussion. I think, and so this author's perspective was that I think these lists were, probably genuinely offered in the sense of people wanting to know what is the important scholarship, but because it seemed so clearly out of a sort of place of desperation that, folks were essentially envisioning racism as something that, oh, I should have known this and now I need to know it. I think for those who didn't find those lists as genuine expressions of real interest, it was that these were issues have always been there. And I think these are books that everyone should be reading because these are sort of core issues that the country has been wrestling with. What do I make of them? I think if more people are reading about race, that's a good thing. But I think what really matters is how that information is processed. You can't just read books on race and racism and think you're just getting it. I think you need conversation. I think you need, and I also think and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think there's a degree to which we kind of compartmentalize our consumption of social justice in that way. Reading is good. Like, I'm pro reading, like read the books, learn. But it means more if you are engaging in, not only engaging in conversation, but also thinking about how do I change my life patterns given what I've read. Because it is good to read, but I think it sort of provides this notion of I've done what I need to do because I've read the books. And the books have always been there. Lots of people have read the books, but the problems are still with us. So I think we have to think further about what do you carry with you with the books, and how do we extend that?
Yeah. And some of my community service has involved board service on very small, with very small organizations. And with each of these organizations over time, there has been a deep interest to do better work with respect to anti-Black racism and diversity in general.
Mm-hmm.
And what that has involved with this work has entailed redirecting resource to communities of concern and rethinking leadership within these organizations so that leadership reflected the diversity they sought. Right. So my question would be in terms of this kind of eagerness to learn more about Blackness, this eagerness to learn more about diversity, is what kind of impact is it having on the structure of corporation? What kind of impact is it having on how resource is directed, how it's generated, how it's directed? What impact is this having with respect to the look of leadership?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point. And also the functioning of leadership. Mm-hmm. I think that.
And structures of accountability.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I want to say more, but I also know we have other questions, but yes, agreed.
Do you want to pick one?
I'm going to pick one. Looking back 50 years as an Asian immigrant, my thought of progression or degradation are ignored, indifferent, isolation, forced to assimilate socially, and now lack of engaging process. Any thought in this journey, and where are we going as a melting pot? Okay.
I have some difficulties with the notion of melting pot. I was hoping we'd move beyond that. That for me, it signals a troublesome understanding of difference. It's an understanding of difference as a problem to solve. It pushes towards a norm that typically is not going to look like us, rather than understanding difference as an opportunity.
Yes. But rather something to be altered.
That it should be maintained that there are benefits to this sort of perspective on difference. One, it generates a kind of discomfort that can be constructive, that can free imagination, free us to think differently, because there are so many sources of input, right? So many different vantage points that are put to work, as opposed to this radical push to make everyone the same.
Right.
We lose an opportunity. And it seems to me, within the context of the United States, if history is any indication, the look of the norm is not us.
Yeah, that's right.
And so on a personal level, I kind of tie the melting pot conversation to the category of people of color. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of that phrasing, people of color, because it seems to suggest that everyone is raced except for white people. Because when we say people of color, we don't mean white Americans. We mean everybody else. And so what we walk away with is a kind of normative structure that excludes, that renders what is most acceptable, what is most recognizable, white. On another level, if someone says to me, Tony, when I see you, I don't see a Black man, then you're not seeing me, right? That is not a compliment.
No.
that to value me shouldn't mean having to wipe out my difference.
That's right. Nor does it require that the difference becomes a sort of decentered from you. I think the other part of the melting pot is a sort of scepter of assimilation, and this notion that we have to lose to gain.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see is that loss is not inconsequential, nor does it help at any level, the individual, the community, or the broader society. I think what's problematic, and kind of getting back to the initial question of how do we think about Blackness, and maybe that's what needs changing. How do we think about progress? I mean, if we're still thinking that it has to look a certain way and it requires certain types of sacrifices, which means that you're shedding something that's core, I think that's a part of the same problem.
And tied to that, it seems to me there's another question that we as a nation have to wrestle with. What are we willing to surrender in order to produce well-being for all?
That's the big question. That is the big question. Okay, so I'm going to go to another question. I think we have a few more minutes. So this is, how can we have a real conversation about the massive investments the nation must make? I think this is piggybacking on what you were saying. Okay, I think it just is apparent. We said, okay, I think it went away. It was too deep.
Well, there's one question left.
I think, okay, it is apparent that we cannot simply rely on the passing of time to promote racial justice and equality. How might we as people work to change our communities and churches so that we can work towards greater understanding that might arise through relationships? Perhaps a greater web of interracial relationships will challenge the exception mentality. But such webs are not easy to build, as I have seen from years in society and church, including my kids' recent experiences in high school.
You want to start?
I do want to start. That's okay. So I think there's two components of this. I think one, certainly building greater relationships across a range of communities, across axes, are always, I think, a benefit. I think I think part of what we have done so poorly, or actually maybe done well in this nation, is built in a sort of normed social segregation that we are amongst our own and you are protected if you're amongst your own, and the exception is going outside. Like the norm should be going outside, because that again creates more resource. I think what part of what we learn as, and I say this also as a parent, but also someone who has read and has seen and has observed how, again, segregation remains in place, is there's a lot that machine is really firm, and working against it is hard. And you see it on the small scale in terms of how people behave with each other, but you see it on the larger scale when you think about how school districts could be redrawn, and they usually get redrawn in a way that constrains and that sort of enforces segregation. But I think, so that's one thing. The machine is huge, and it is, creating a greater web of relationships is important, but it's the reason why it's not as easy is because that machine is deeply in place, but obviously necessary. Yeah. But the other side of this is this notion that those relationships are critical because some communities of disadvantage would gain from communities of advantage. The problem is that inequity. If a predominantly Black community has less, interfacing with a white community, I think, may seem like it creates balance, but the problem is that community has less. Like, that community should not have less. And so I think part of what we're wrestling with is very similar to the melting pot conversation. It's this notion of we can advantage, or we can improve the circumstances of of disadvantaged groups by joining them with advantage. The problem is how did they get disadvantaged in the first place? Mm-hmm. And until we wrestle with that, those relationships across those boundaries are never going to be enough, mm-hmm. because those systems that created the disadvantage will continue to be in place. You know, as long as we still think of communities as a sort of zero-sum game and you have to lose so I can win, then it doesn't matter how many friends the folks make.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think solidarity is extremely important, but I think there's work that religious organizations have to do, that I think religious organizations really need to give some attention to their theology, their doctrines and creeds, to assess whether or not there are elements of their theology that work against solidarity, that work against an appreciation of difference.
And that goes back to how people are thinking and the moment at which you can really reshape how someone, like just that perception.
Yeah. I mean, because if we're honest about it, just take churches, for example, in the United States. They mm-hmm. have been on both sides of this issue of anti-Black racism. And so, right, it requires that kind of hard work. What are there elements of our theological thinking? Are there elements of our moral and ethical platform that actually counter our efforts to be outward facing and useful?
Mm. That's right. Oh my gosh.
I think that's just about our time. I think we've got a matter of seconds.
Just a matter of seconds. If y'all have a couple more minutes, I do have that. I did find that question that we lost. If y'all would be willing to answer that. Is that okay?
Sure.
So it's, how can we have a real conversation about the massive investments the nation must make to right these wrongs of their own making? It seems that during Reconstruction, America initially started trying to take small steps toward undoing the economic and harm from slavery. But as soon as places like Black Wall Street and Tulsa were developed and the first Black congressmen were elected, the nation quickly turned to crushing Black communities with violence, criminalization, lynching, Black codes, etc.
The first part of the question one more time? That was kind of long. I lost
it's a long one. It's a long one. How can we have a real conversation about the massive investments the nation must make to right these wrongs of their own making?
Well, I think, okay, I'll start and then Tony, please jump in. I think the first is reckoning with the history of that history in a very real way. It's not well known. I mean, it's well known for those of us who have been thinking about these issues, and it's increasingly known. But I think the first step is, you know, kind of coming back to how do we think about Blackness? How do we think about, you know, our nation's history and how, you know, again, the conditions of racial inequality are made by design. I think the first step is to know that these were not merely the acts of a couple of really mean people, but that these were decisions that were actively made to benefit, with the understanding that this was necessary and important, and that kind of tension or that kind of ability exists in every single political decision has that potential to be just as egregious. I think, and then I think the second thing is realizing that that's what essentially is the foundation of our nation. You know, that those types of decisions, those kinds of actions, that kind of violence is embedded deeply within. And I think once you really reckon with that, then we can start having the conversation about what needs to happen to undo it. But I don't think we have a full appreciation of what that means and the consequences of that. Because whenever I read about or think about Reconstruction or Tulsa or any of those issues, I'm like, it didn't have to happen. Like, that was a lot of work that folks put in to make sure that certain populations would just either not have or have less than or have no quality of life. Like, we could have had Black Wall Street. What would that have meant to the level of wealth that African Americans have in this country? But we don't, because, and I think the first step is to really reckon with what that was and how it gets reproduced. That's really meta, but I think that's where I would start.
Yeah. It seems to me there's no shortage of platforms that would allow for us to have public conversation, no shortage. What we lack is the will, right? We as a nation have not decided that these issues matter enough to have this sort of conversation that pushes us out of our comfort zone. And so it seems to me it builds. We have these conversations with family and friends. We have these conversations in the context of communities. We have these conversations within the context of larger collectives. And we elect people who are committed to these conversations and hold them accountable. Mm-hmm. But first, we have to decide as a nation, these conversations are worth having.
Yeah. Yes. These conversations are worth having.
I think we covered all the questions. Is that right?
You did. You guys, this was absolutely
Yay,
amazing.
Jennifer.
You did.
Thank you.
I am so sorry for the questions we didn't get to. There are a few, but we are out of time. This has been, I mean, I think it just means we need to do this again with y'all. This was
Anytime.
amazing. This was amazing. It's so fun and exhilarating to watch two professors who study these things, work on these things, talk about this subject. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of our guests who could join today. I hope this was as wonderful for you as it was for me. I know I have a lot to think about, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful day.